Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. It's time for another installment of our A to Z of PlayStation 1 Hidden Gems. The letter C had quite a few to choose from, and here I'm going to show you the ones that I had the most fun with. As always, make sure you go back and watch the previous letters to see if there's any games that you've missed out on, and why not subscribe while you're at it if you haven't done already, so you don't miss out on any of the other videos that we've got coming up. Now, how about I shut the hell up and we take a look at some games, beginning with the letter C. We're going to start with Sled from Namco. Sled is a one-on-one vehicle combat game where you choose from a decent selection of characters, each of which pilot their own Sled, a funky future fight vehicle equipped with all sorts of weapons, and then you take to the arena to blow each other to smithereens. The graphics for the game are quite good, with some interesting designs for both characters and their crafts. They're all suitably post-apocalyptic, futuristic type things, and they have nice bright designs, which is something I like. A lot of the times in games like this, they're just full of greys and browns. Now, the game does actually give you two options, as this is based on an arcade game. You can switch between the original graphics or what they call realistic graphics. The original ones are noticeably worse, so I definitely recommend keeping it on realistic, though watch out, as you'll never know if you're playing a game or looking out the window. Anyway, once you've picked your vehicle, you're dropped in a relatively small arena that is filled with loads of walls that you can use as cover, as well as weapon pickups that you'll need to replenish your missiles and shield. The controls here can take a couple of rounds to get used to, but once you do, they work well. The default controls see you use the D-pad to move forward and back, as well as strafe, and you use your shoulder buttons to turn left and right. Normally, you'd use the D-pad to move and turn and the shoulder buttons to strafe, but after a couple of rounds I did find that it wasn't an issue, and everything runs pretty damn smoothly, and it makes circle strafing pretty easy. You only have two attack buttons to worry about, one's for your machine gun and the other is for your missiles or laser, depending on what weapon your craft has. This keeps the combat very simple, which is a good and a bad thing, as it means it's very easy to pick up and play, but at the same time there's actually very little to the combat. Your machine gun has unlimited ammo, but it does overheat, and you have limited ammo for your missiles, which you can lock onto your opponent with, or if your opponent is shooting at you, they'll lock onto you. It is a shame there aren't more weapons to mix things up, though this is a port from the arcade game, which I'm guessing would have been a simple button setup. The battles don't last very long at all, and they can often be less than a minute. The arcade mode just sees you picking a character and blasting through enemies till you get to the boss, and this doesn't take long at all. But your ship gets damaged just as easy as your enemies do, which means that you can be destroyed in just 4 or 5 direct hits from a rocket. This does add some challenge to the game and ensures you try to stay on the move and use the walls as cover, especially as you only get to one try to make it all the way through. You get no extra lives or continues, and you have to try and beat every single enemy in arcade mode, so really it's a good job that the battles are quick, but it can be annoying when you're on the last stage, as the AI gets really tough and you don't have time to figure out their patterns or anything like that. Having said that though, this is a lot of fun, and especially in multiplayer, which really is the main focus. I'd actually never heard of this game before, and like many in these videos in this series, it's got a generic name and the screenshots didn't make it look particularly fun, but it is a decent arcade action game that would be perfect for a game night with friends. Some more cyber action now with Cyber. This is a third-person action game where you control 3 characters who are part of an intergalactic justice force. Each member of the team is from a different planet and has their own special characteristics. Though these aren't particularly original. You have the all-round bloke, and he's from Earth, the massive hulking guy who is slow but strong, and then you've got the fast but not so powerful character who's good at jumping and can even glide. There's also a couple of extra non-playable characters, namely a cute monkey thing that's the pilot of your spaceship, and of course the sexy big boob woman, who sadly isn't playable, but she is the leader of the gang. The story is simple enough. You go through various levels dishing out justice to naughty people by murdering them and destroying their stuff. You know, the usual. But doing this is actually a whole lot of fun. Each level sees you running around narrow corridors and some open rooms. All of the while you'll come across a number of enemies, from soldiers to crazy insect-like aliens, all of which need punching in the face. You also find lots of items along the way that will help you, which is where the game gets more interesting, as certain enemies have certain weaknesses and you'll need to equip certain items and powers to make sure you do massive damage. Once you choose your character, you have to complete a full space dungeon with them, which basically consists of finding the exit, and then you can move on to the next one. Something that is kind of annoying here is that you actually have to beat all the levels with all the characters, at least as far as I can tell. Sadly, there doesn't seem to be any English translation of this game, so there might actually be a way, and I just don't know how to do it. Interestingly though, all of the voices are in Japanese, so I'm guessing at some point this was going to be released outside of Japan. I just don't think it ever happened. But anyway, you have to get all of your characters through each level, and between stages you can select between your characters and use them on any of the available levels. So you could just choose one character and see how far you can get in the game with them, and then use the others if you only really need to. Also, when you do replay the stages, apart from some extra enemies appearing, all the objectives remain completed, which is nice, and the map is also revealed as you play, so it will be revealed for any new characters when they enter that stage too. So at least if you do have to do this, it is just a case of running to the exit, and you don't have to worry about completing the objectives that you've already done. Now the graphics here are fantastic. Everything looks really impressive and runs very well, though there is some slowdown when there's a few enemies on screen, but the game has a great use of colour and the character designs are awesome. The controls are also spot on, though the camera can take a while to get used to. You don't control it properly, you can only make it snap to behind you, though this is fine when you get used to it. The combat here is really good. You've got combo attacks as well as character specific specials, and all of it feels really well done. You can lock onto enemies, which I highly recommend doing, as it can make attacking smaller enemies much easier. You'll find computer terminals around the levels too. These do a few things. Some reveal the full map, some open doors, and the rest I have no idea what they do as it's all in Japanese, but I'm sure they're useful. This is also a very addictive game and one that I've really found hard to put down. Thankfully all the items and menus are in English, so actually playing through this one is very doable even if you don't know Japanese. It's just that you won't be able to get any of the story or intel. This is definitely one I recommend checking out. C12 Final Resistance is from Sony themselves and is a great third-person action game where you control a cybernetically enhanced soldier who's basically a good Terminator, and you set off around the ruins of what I think is London, though it could just be a nondescript English city, where you have to fight off a robot alien menace. The game gives a decent amount of story with some cool cinematics with some terribly acted voices, but this is the PlayStation 1, I expect no less. You'll find a few weapons to help you fight the alien bastards. You get your usual machine guns and lasers, as well as a laser sword thing that is pretty damn powerful, but of course it means you have to get up close and personal and risk taking a lot of damage yourself. Thankfully, you can also pick up shields which you activate by holding the triangle button. It took me a while to get used to using this, but trust me, you really should get used to it, as you can't take a ton of hits before snuffing it. But be careful, as the shield can only take so many hits before it runs out. In fact, the combat here is actually pretty tough, and in some areas, even early on in the game, can be very tricky while you get used to locking onto enemies. But it's never really that unfair, as dead enemies do drop health and ammo for you. Also, as you progress, you learn new abilities, and you get weapon upgrades that can help you out. What's also cool is that as you're a robo-man, you have robo-vision, and you can go into first-person mode to take out enemies. This also gives you information on your enemies, as well as tells you about objectives, and highlights anything interesting that you might see on the screen in front of you. So it's good for finding things like environmental hazards, as well as items that you might have missed. It's kind of like a primitive version of the visor scanning in the Metroid Prime games. Thankfully, there is normally stuff you can take cover behind, and this is recommended when in gunfights. The game looks decent, though it is a victim of the whole everything is brown and grey. Now, I know it's the apocalypse and all that, but some colour would be nice. However, what is here looks good, and it has a lot of detail, which does sometimes come at the expense of frame rate issues, as well as the infamous PlayStation 1 texture warping. The levels are all pretty large and they'll require you to do a fair amount of exploring. You'll need to find items and keys to open new areas, and you'll get the regular calls from your army mates to give you updates and mission objectives complete. You'll find new checkpoints around the levels too, so make sure you use these and save often, as even a single enemy can catch you unaware and finish you off. I had a lot of fun playing this one, and I actually managed to complete it in roughly 5 or 6 hours, though I reckon I could do it in about half that now I know what I'm doing. This was a lot of fun to play through, and having it set in England is a nice change, even though it doesn't really feel like England and could really just be anywhere. This is a solid game with good controls, decent graphics and a solid challenge. Give it a go. Crisis City is another game that didn't leave Japan, at least I don't think so. I should really Google these things. Anyway, it's a bit of a strange game that I wasn't sure about at first, but then it really started to grow on me. I'm not entirely sure what the story is, as once again it's all in Japanese, but you get 6 characters to choose from, each with their own backstory. Then you set off around Crisis City, killing bad guys and doing action rolls. Along the way you meet all of the other playable characters and they act as the bosses that you need to have a shootout with. Eventually you become the king of the city, I guess. Each character has their own unique weapon as well as grenades. They also seem to have slightly different health and speed stats, and these things really indicate the difficulty, as some of the weapons are noticeably more powerful than others. Some are rapid fire and some only shoot a couple of shots before needing a lengthy reload. But don't worry, no matter who you are, you get unlimited ammo. In fact, these imbalances actually play out during the story mode too, as when you're fighting the other characters in their boss fights, you can often beat them in less than 10 seconds, whereas some will require you to retry time and time again while you try and avoid their gunfire. Now, you do get unlimited continues, and if you're on a boss, you'll start from the beginning of the boss fight, but if you die anywhere else in the level, you will have to go all the way back to the start. This can be annoying, but none of the levels are really that long. In fact, the game even has a time attack mode, so speedrunning it is actually part of the gameplay. You've got a handy lock-on feature which you'll really need to use, as the game has fixed camera angles that switch as you move around. These can make it really hard to actually tell where you are in relation to anything else. The perspective is tricky. This also makes it easy to run around in circles, as it can be very confusing as to where the exits are on each screen. Graphically, the game is fine, the backgrounds are pretty detailed, but the characters are nothing to write home about, and it's often hard to make out any of their details. I will say though that this game has some really awesome anime vibe to it, and it really reminds me of films like Akira or Ghost in the Shell with its dark Neo City vibes. They are great. The controls are good and responsive, though they can get stuck on the scenery. You've got a dodge roll that you'll need to avoid alien bullets, and in a lot of cases oncoming traffic, which is always all over the place and out to get you, it seems. Things can be a bit jerky in the animation department, but it never really affects the gameplay, which overall is always pretty solid. It's a shame this didn't have a release elsewhere, as it's a really unique action game that has some really good ideas and is actually pretty cinematic. Try it out for some fast-paced arcade-style action. As we had 2 cyber games earlier, let's have 2 crisis games. Crises? Who knows? This one is Crisis Beat from Namco. Sadly, it's not Crisis Bear like I'd originally typed. I'd definitely play that game. Anyway, Crisis Beat is a beat-em-up that's a cross between Streets of Rage, Die Hard and Speed 2. And if that isn't the best combination of things ever, then I don't know what is. From that description, you already know everything about this game. It's equal parts good, bad, janky, and just downright fun if you switch off your brain. So yeah, the story is that you're on a luxury cruise ship which gets taken over by terrorists. Luckily, our 4 playable characters are all one-man or woman armies, and they decide to take it upon themselves to murder all the terrorists, which I suppose is fair enough really. What's interesting is that all of the 4 characters do play quite differently, with different movesets. You have a couple of attack buttons, and depending on what input combinations you do, simple combos can become crazy wrestling moves, and the game actually rewards you for trying out new combos. Some of them are really cool. One of the main focuses here is something a little different too, and these are the environment attacks. You can use just about every piece of scenery as a weapon. However, rather than picking them up, depending on what it is, you use it differently. For example, tables and chairs can be flipped over onto enemies, whereas trees or bigger things like bins can be spun around like a spinning top and you'll hit everyone in range. As well as this, if you line up an enemy correctly so they're between you and the object, you'll do a devastating lock-on attack where you smash them through it, doing massive damage and killing most enemies in one hit, though it's not always easy to get them in the right place. Something else that's kind of different is that the characters are paired off in the story. All the events take place at the same time, but you see it from the perspective of each character slightly differently. This gives the game some great replay value, as you'll want to play through it with everyone as they have their own unique stages and bosses, only ever crossing over with the other character pair at certain times. Graphically, I'll be honest, the game is pretty ugly, with some very low polygon models, poor animation, and some very pixely scenery. Interestingly though, the CGI cutscenes are amazing and have a ton of detail in them. It's quite a jarring transition. You get a decent amount of enemies on screen here, but the enemies never really put up much of a fight, with some of the bosses only really being a challenge. But the combat is loads of fun, and the fact that you can beat the game in about an hour means that you don't really mind. There is a timer on screen, though you can basically ignore it, as you'll always get plenty of time. Overall, this is a fairly standard beat 'em up, but it's got some really cool ideas in it, and never outstays its welcome, as well as the cheesy story that really makes it fun. This is very much a guilty pleasure of mine, and is definitely not a polished game, but the core mechanics are solid, and if you're playing through with a mate, you'll have a pretty good time. Time for some racing action now with Circuit Breakers. This is quite a strange racing game that takes a bit of time to get used to, but once you do, it is pretty fun. It plays a lot more like games like Micro Machines with a very arcade, small-scale vibe. You choose from a handful of vehicles, of course each of which play slightly differently, and then you get to compete in a bunch of races, with the aim, of course, to get first position in each one. Every time you do get first place, you open up a new track, until eventually there's no more tracks to unlock. But it's not as easy as it sounds. The tracks are full of twists and turns, as well as hazards that can destroy your car, and there's often parts of the track that you can fall off completely. If you do fall or are destroyed, you don't lose though, you just respawn, which is done fairly quickly, but if you do mess up more than a few times, the chances are you're going to lose thanks to the annoyingly good AI that rarely makes a mistake. This can make for some frustrating moments, as the computer racers will speed through the course with ease, meaning if you mess up, which will happen at first, you literally won't see another racer for the entire race. And of course, it does make just overtaking incredibly hard at times, especially as the tracks are very narrow and can barely fit two cars down them at the best of times. Something you've probably noticed from the footage, which can add to the frustration, is the strange camera view. It's not fixed behind your vehicle, and it often moves around all over the course to give you a different view of the track while you're racing. This is something that kind of looks cool, but you have no control over it, so when it moves you have to compensate it with the controls, meaning you could be in the middle of turning left only for the camera to move and switches the perspective, so you've actually got to end up turning right. It's kind of annoying. Now I know so far I have pretty much just moaned about the game, but it's on this list. And so actually, despite all of these things, it is actually a fun game to play. The races are short and there aren't really actually that many of them, so the idea is that you'll be playing the same race multiple times to learn the tracks and complete them with the fewest mistakes. Also, the vehicles do come into play, as they're all different shapes and sizes, some of which can suit certain courses more than others, which can be used to your advantage. So for example, if you're the Mini, ironically it's actually the biggest car here, so if you get the lead on a narrow track, all the other cars are going to have a really hard time overtaking you, but like I said earlier, this does work both ways, so watch out. There's power-ups in the game too, but these really do feel like a bit of an afterthought. You get a basic rocket shot, a boost, and there's a few items that make you either grow or shrink. These can come in handy, but are few and far between. Really, they could have removed them altogether and just dumbed down the AI a bit, and it probably would have actually worked out better. But the game has that addictive quality to it. It's got fast loading, which means that losing a race isn't really the end of the world, and it's not a chore to go back in. Also, I found this game has that just one more try quality where I'd get a little bit better every time I tried a race, so I knew eventually that I'd win, and I did. The graphics here do the job, but they're not anything special. The courses are all varied through the 4 or 5 themes that you get of swamps, cities and Egyptian ruins, and you even get boat levels, but I hate these, they suck. You can play this with up to 4 players, and I think that would be an absolute blast with 3 friends battling it out. It's a tough game and will likely frustrate some people, but I would say give it a try if you can. Fight time now, and for the letter C, we have Capcom vs SNK Millennium Fight 2000 Pro. What a stupid name, but it's a great game. Now, it's Street Fighter vs SNK, so you would have thought it'd be more well known, but it's a series that's surprisingly not talked about all that often. So yeah, it's a fighting game where you choose from a selection of the best and most well endowed for Street Fighter and SNK fighting characters. All your favourites are here, and they all look great with some amazing 2D sprite work and animation. Of course the controls are spot on, and pulling off moves is always easy. Now I really need to play more SNK fighting games, as I was able to figure out some of their moves, but not all of them. For the most part they are the same as Street Fighter ones, so if you've played those games you'll do well enough here, but there are definitely times where I couldn't get a single move for some of the characters. What's cool here is that you have to choose from a few characters. Each one is given a ranking and score, and your fight team is allowed only so many points, so you can choose to have 3 or 4 lower scored characters, or 1 or 2 higher scored characters, or of course a combination of this. This is actually noticeable too, with the lower scored characters usually doing less damage but taking a lot. Fighters keep their health bars between rounds, so if you do have lots of characters, just do as much damage as possible. Well, kind of goes without saying, I suppose. The game does have to stop and load between rounds as the new characters are loaded in, but this only takes a few seconds and isn't too much of an issue. What's cool is that you do get points after completing tournaments and matches, which you can then use to purchase stronger versions of the fighters in your fighter shop. This is a nice touch, and even though the gameplay is so good you won't need an excuse to keep coming back to the game, it is a good reason to keep replaying it. Really, that's kind of all there is to say. It's a fighting game from Capcom and SNK, so you should all know the drill by now. It's very good quality though, and it doesn't get talked about very often. It even has a sequel which I've got for the GameCube, which I really love too. This game is great fun, and it's definitely one that any fighting fan should have in their collection. Here is Crime Crackers from Sony Computer Entertainment. This is another title that was never released outside of Japan to my knowledge, and another one that I kinda wish was released, or at least has a fan translation. It's a first-person RPG shooter game where you play as the Crime Crackers, a trio of intergalactic space law enforcers that have to stop bastards from being bastards. Hang on, haven't we heard that already in this video? Anyway, this time round you have some anime girls that may or may not be over 18, it's hard to tell with these things, as well as a big space lizard ox thing. You control all of the characters at the same time, and basically whoever's picture is in the middle of the bottom HUD bit there is who's leading the team at that time and whose weapon you'll be using. They can each pick up and use different weapons and items as you go, so you'll be switching regularly to the more powerful ones. The blonde cat lady, let's call her Barry, uses a scratch attack, which is basically a melee. This is pretty powerful, but it requires you to get up close and personal. The brown haired lady, we'll call her Charles. She has a rapid fire machine gun, which isn't that powerful, but it fires fast, though it does run through ammo like nobody's business. And then there's the Oxman, let's call him Cecilia. He has a powerful but slow laser blast. You do have to be careful as the ammo is shared between all characters, so when using Charles and Cecilia you have to make sure you're using the right character, as it's not like you'll be saving ammo. Barry's slash attack doesn't use ammo at all, but like I said before, you'll be taking a lot of damage if you use it, as you do have to get up close. All 3 of the characters have their own life bar, but if all 3 die, it's game over. Now, the game looks great with some really cool enemies and animation, but it's also really damn tough. Every level is a narrow corridor filled with enemies' items and some pretty open rooms. Now again, I'm pretty sure I've said that already today. And you'll need to make sure you explore every inch of these to make sure you find all the weapon and health pickups before taking on the crime lord on every stage. The problems here though are that the corridors and rooms are all actually quite small and cramped, so avoiding attacks is very hard. Also, it will definitely take a bit of time to get used to the mechanics here. You walk around in first person obviously, and to attack you press the square button. When you do this, a crosshair will appear on the screen. When this crosshair is on screen, you can't actually move forward or backwards, but you can strafe and turn. So basically you can only circle strafe while attacking, which often is a problem as you're in a narrow corridor where you can't really move at all, so it's almost impossible to avoid taking damage. And the bosses, they all take a ton of hits, and it's bloody hard to avoid their shots, but not impossible, so it is doable. The game really does take a fair bit of practice to get used to, but I would say that it's worth it. The gameplay is smooth and the graphics are really good. Everything is in Japanese, but I didn't have any trouble figuring out what I needed to do, and most of the items are pretty self-explanatory. You'll just have to make up your own story as you go along, unless you speak Japanese. You know the drill. If this looks good to you, give it a go. Let's get some 2D action platform going now with Khouso Gran. Apologies if I've butchered that pronunciation. This is, like I said, a 2D action platform game that's kind of similar to the Mega Man games, but also not really. You play, I'm assuming, as the Gran, a schoolgirl who is the usual anime thing of being awkward around boys, and her senpai is kidnapped by an evil sexy woman, so you turn into a super cyber lady to rescue him. It's cute, isn't it? Now, there is actually a lot more story to it than that, as the game is based on an anime and there's a proper reason that you're a super powerful girl, but I can't be bothered to read Wikipedia. The game has some cool 2D sprites and the story is all told through cutscenes that I'm assuming are from the anime. The levels are fairly large, kind of open world stages that you'll need to explore in order to find keys to open doors or power down force fields. Eventually you'll find the boss and then it's a fight to the death. Kill the boss and you steal their power to use from yourself, complete with a cool new costume change, you know, kind of like Mega Man. However, unlike the blue bell end, you can shoot in all 8 directions, which is handy as there's enemies all over the place that you'll be fighting. These range from simple soldiers to crazy flying mechs, and some of them are really hard to take down, though the game does a pretty good job of keeping things fair, with a decent amount of pickups that refill your health, and even make your health bar longer. You can even get screen clearing bombs, which is nice. It's not perfect though, as the controls can be quite floaty and the jumping is very difficult in some sections. Each of the suit power-ups work pretty fine, but again the controls can be tricky, like your default suit which has a grappling hook. This is very hard to use. Normally it's used to get you over spikes and things like that, but often you end up falling into them or hitting them unfairly. This is partly because the hit detection is kind of unforgiving, coupled with a lot of blind jumps that end up on spikes. Some of the later stages can be really tricky too, as you almost can't avoid taking damage if you haven't learned the level layouts, thanks to spikes and enemies being all over the place. And speaking of layouts, that's another thing that can be annoying. There's a few times where I'd make it to the end of a level only to find that I needed a key that I'd missed, which isn't always the game's fault, as that's kind of the point, it's open world. But it meant that there's a lot of backtracking, often past a ton of respawning enemies and traps that are hard not to take damage from, just so I could find the key. But by this time I will have already collected the health power-ups on the level, so can just about make it back to the boss, but with no health. This basically means I'd have to restart the whole level, which is what you have to do when you die, and that's never fun. But here, the levels aren't that huge, and you can often get through them in about 10 minutes or so once you know where you're going. It's just a shame that most of the challenge in the game comes down to wonky hit detection, floaty controls, and confusing level design, which, by the way, there is no map for either. But it is still here, so you know what that means. It's definitely not a bad game, and I did enjoy playing it. If you're a fan of 2D action games, give this one a go. While it's not as good as the Mega Man games by a long shot, it is a nice distraction for the 2 or 3 hours it will take you to beat it. And finally for today, the sexiest game available for the PlayStation, Chou Aniki. Now, I'll be honest, I've been a fan of this series ever since I heard about it, I think back on GameSack a few years ago. There's just nothing else like it. Sort of. For those uncultured of you out there that don't know Chou Aniki, it's a crazy over-the-top homoerotic shooter series and it's glorious. You can choose to play as a buff dude or a sparkly princess in a story that is all in Japanese, so I've got no idea what it's going on about, and I kind of like it that way. And then you set out across some pretty damn tough levels, shooting hordes of muscle-bound men wearing G-strings, doing all kinds of weird things, as well as other strange things like floating heads, men on office chairs, and crazy bald men with AK-47s. The appeal for me here is just how batshit crazy everything is. Nothing makes sense at all. The enemies are all bonkers, and all the bosses are even more crazy. They could be giant frogs, towers of men, or a bloke in a crazy looking sex chair that has another man where his dingaling should be. It's great, and the whole thing is played for laughs and is meant to be as crazy as it is. The graphics are mostly digitised bodybuilders, and while the animation isn't great, you'll still want to play through each level to see what crazy shite is in store for you next. As it's a shooter, you get a few weapon power-ups that the enemies drop. Here you need to collect as many of these orbs as they drop as you can, as this powers up your shot, which is essential as enemies take a ton of hits, even on the lower difficulties, and if you die, of course, you'll be powered down. The more you collect, also, the more specials you can do. You've got weird men that follow you around, and these act as your options. You can use these to deflect enemy bullets or send them forward to damage enemies, though I could never really get the hang of how these work properly, so I just tend to keep them close to me so they could absorb attacks from enemies. Unfortunately, that's really all there is to say about this one. It's a fairly standard shooter in terms of gameplay mechanics, but when you look at the subject matter and the style, it really is like nothing you've ever played, unless you've already played it. And yes, there are more games in this series for modern consoles. It's just a shame that there's none for the PS4 generation. This is a bloody hard game though, and you only get a few lives and continues, but trust me, it is well worth your time. If you can handle crazy Japanese humour and aren't a homophobic tosser, then this is definitely one for you to play. So there you go. 10 hidden gems for the PS1, starting with the letter C. Let me know any games that you'd include for this, or any other letter for that matter. On screen now you can see where you can follow us, so please do. We've got loads of cool content for everyone to enjoy. Now all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.